Sometimes the most meaningful bonds form in unexpected moments. In 1847, a lonely cowboy walked into Murphy's saloon with nothing left to lose. His wife had died that winter, and loneliness was his only companion. By night's end, he walked away. From that poker table, not with gold or land, but with 2 orphaned wolf pups tossed in as a cruel joke. The whole town laughed at raising wild beasts. But the cowboy poured his heart into those helpless creatures, feeding them by hand and teaching them trust. Years later, when danger came calling, those wolves would repay him in a way no man in the West could ever forget. But what happened that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the February sky of 1847. Its snow-covered peaks standing like silent sentinels over the small frontier settlement of Cedar Creek. Thomas Hartwell, Tom to those who knew him, and there weren't many who could claim that privilege anymore, rode his chestnut mare down the main street with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and no one waiting for his return. At 45, Tom possessed the weathered handsomeness common to men who had spent their lives working under the western sun. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, never stopped moving to the simple gold wedding band on his left ring finger, a habit he'd developed in the months since Sarah's passing. The ring had grown loose on his finger, a reflection of the weight he'd lost since that terrible December morning when he'd found her still and cold in their bed, claimed by the fever that had swept through the territory like wildfire. The ring caught the weak winter sunlight as he unconsciously twisted it, the metal worn smooth from 20 years of marriage and 3 months of nervous fidgeting. Sarah had placed it there herself on their wedding day, her green eyes sparkling with joy as she whispered promises of a lifetime together. Neither of them had imagined that lifetime would be cut so brutally short. Tom's homestead sat 5 miles outside Cedar Creek, nestled in a valley where Willow Creek wound its way through stands of aspen and pine. He had chosen the location with Sarah's help back in 1825, when they were young and full of dreams about building something lasting together. The cabin they'd constructed with their own hands had grown over the years. An additional room here, a larger kitchen there, each expansion marking another chapter in their shared story. Now the cabin felt cavernous and hollow, filled with memories that cut deeper than any physical wound Tom had ever sustained. Sarah's sewing basket still sat beside her favorite chair, her apron hung on its peg by the kitchen window, and her books remained stacked on the mantelpiece exactly as she had left them. Tom couldn't bring himself to move them, but neither could he bear to look at them directly. The people of Cedar Creek had watched Tom's gradual withdrawal from community life with the patient understanding common to frontier folk who knew that grief carved its own path through a man's heart. Doc Morrison, a slight man in his 60s whose gentle manner belied his sharp intelligence, had been Tom's closest friend since their arrival in the territory. He made regular visits to check on the widower, though his medical bag was merely an excuse for the companionship both men craved. Tom's always been a solitary type, Doc would explain to concerned townspeople, but Sarah was his anchor to the world. Without her, he's drifting. Sheriff John Wheeler, a bear of a man whose imposing presence masked a thoughtful nature, had known Tom since their service together in the war. Both men carried scars from those bloody years, though Tom's ran deeper and had never fully healed. Wheeler understood the particular brand of isolation that could consume a man who had seen too much and lost too much. The third member of Tom's small circle was Murphy himself, the Irish immigrant who ran the town's only saloon with a combination of stern authority and unexpected compassion. Seamus Murphy had arrived in Cedar Creek with nothing but ambition and a talent for reading men's characters in their faces. His establishment served as the unofficial community center, where news was shared, disputes were settled, and lonely Souls could find temporary refuge from their troubles. Tom's routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. He would tend to his small herd of cattle, maintain his property, and make weekly trips to town for supplies. But since Sarah's death, these visits had grown shorter and more purposeful. He spoke only when necessary, conducted his business efficiently, and returned to his empty cabin as quickly as possible. The harsh winter of 1846 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that even the most experienced frontiersmen spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. It was the kind of winter that tested everything a man thought he knew about survival, and it had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. Sarah had been among the casualties, though her death had been slower and more cruel than the quick. Freezing, that took others. The fever had started as a minor cough in early December. Sarah had insisted it was nothing, continuing her household duties with the stubborn determination that Tom had both loved and worried about throughout their marriage. But the cough had worsened, developing into something deeper and more persistent. By Christmas, she was bedridden, her face flushed with fever and her breathing labored. Tom had ridden through blizzards to bring Doc Morrison to their cabin, but even the doctor's considerable skills had been powerless against the illness that seemed determined to rob Tom of the only thing that mattered to him. Sarah had died on the morning of December 28th, leaving Tom to face the new year alone for the first time in 2 decades. The funeral had been a simple affair, attended by most of the town despite the bitter cold and treacherous roads. Sarah had been beloved in Cedar Creek for her kindness, her skill with healing herbs, and her ability to make even the roughest cowboy feel welcome in her home. She had possessed the rare gift of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. In the weeks following the burial, well-meaning neighbors had brought casseroles and offered help with the ranch work. The widows of Cedar Creek had made particularly persistent efforts to draw Tom back into social life, sensing an opportunity to provide comfort to a man who clearly needed it. But Tom had politely declined all offers, preferring the solitude that matched his internal emptiness. His daily routine became a form of meditation, each familiar task a way of marking time without having to think too deeply about the future that stretched ahead of him like an unmarked trail. He fed the cattle, repaired fences, chopped wood for the stove, and tried not to notice how quiet the cabin had become without Sarah's humming or the rustle of her skirts as she moved about their home. The wedding ring had become his most constant companion, a physical connection to the woman who had given his life meaning and purpose. He would catch himself talking to it sometimes, sharing thoughts and concerns as if Sarah could still hear him through the simple band of gold. It was a harmless comfort, he told himself, though he made sure never to do it when others might observe. Such behavior, February had brought no relief from the isolation, though the bitter cold had finally begun to ease. Tom found himself making more frequent trips to town, ostensibly for supplies, but truthfully for the simple human contact that had become as necessary as food or shelter. Even brief conversations with the shopkeeper or a nod of greeting from a passing neighbor helped to remind him that the world still existed beyond his grief. It was on one such evening, when the loneliness had grown particularly oppressive, that Tom made the decision that would change everything. Instead of purchasing his usual supplies and heading directly home, he found himself standing outside Murphy's saloon, listening to the low murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from within. The establishment was warm and inviting, its windows glowing with lamplight that promised companionship and temporary escape from the harsh realities of frontier life. Tom had never been much of a drinker, and he certainly wasn't a gambling man, but the prospect of sitting in silence at his kitchen table for another evening had become unbearable. He pushed through the heavy wooden door, the wedding ring catching, the light from the oil lamps as his hand gripped the handle. The warmth and noise of the saloon enveloped him like an embrace, and for the first time in months, Tom felt something approaching peace. He couldn't have known that this simple decision to seek human company on a cold February night would set in motion events that would transform not only his own life, but the entire community he had gradually withdrawn from. The ring on his finger seemed to pulse with its own warmth as he stepped into the crowded room, as if Sarah herself were guiding him toward a destiny neither of them could have imagined. Murphy's saloon buzzed with the comfortable energy of men seeking refuge from winter's lingering grip. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the aroma of whiskey, while conversations flowed as freely as the drinks Murphy poured with practiced efficiency. Tom settled himself at the bar, ordering a simple beer and allowing the familiar sounds of frontier life to wash over him like a balm. He had been nursing his drink for perhaps an hour when the stranger entered. The man moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to making quick assessments and quicker decisions. His black coat was well tailored but travel-worn, and his eyes held the calculating gleam that experienced gamblers cultivated like a trade skill. Most telling of all was the worn leather satchel he carried, secured with brass buckles that caught the lamplight as he surveyed the room. "Evening, gentlemen," the stranger announced, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard throughout the saloon without seeming to shout. "Marcus Peterson's the name, though most folks call me Snake Eyes for obvious reasons." He gestured toward his pale green eyes, which seemed to miss nothing as they swept across the assembled patrons. Murphy looked up from the glass he was polishing, his expression neutral but alert. In his years of running the establishment, he had developed an instinct for trouble, and something about Peterson set his internal warnings humming. "What brings you to Cedar Creek, Mr. Peterson?" Doc Morrison asked from his corner table, ever the diplomat in social situations. "Business and leisure," Peterson replied smoothly, settling the mysterious satchel beside an empty chair at the room's central table. "I'm a traveling man with interests in various ventures. Tonight, however, I'm hoping to find some gentleman interested in a friendly game of poker." The suggestion sparked immediate interest among several patrons. Poker was rare entertainment. In Cedar Creek, where most gambling consisted of informal wagers on horse races or arm wrestling contests, the prospect of a real game with an experienced player held undeniable appeal. Tom found himself drawn to the conversation despite his usual reluctance to engage with strangers. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had driven him from his cabin, or maybe it was simple curiosity about the well-dressed gambler who seemed so out of place in their rough frontier town. Whatever the reason, he turned from the bar to observe the proceedings. "I suppose I could spare a few hands," volunteered Jake Harrison, a local ranch foreman known for his aggressive poker style. "Though I should warn you, we play honest games here." Peterson's smile was all practiced charm. "I wouldn't have it any other way, friend. Honesty is the foundation of any good game." Within minutes, a table had been organized with Harrison, Doc Morrison, Sheriff Wheeler, and two other locals. Taking seats around the green felt surface, Peterson produced a well-worn deck of cards from his coat pocket, executing a series of impressive shuffles that demonstrated considerable skill. "We need one more player to make it interesting," Peterson observed, his gaze settling on Tom with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. "How about you, friend? You look like a man who understands the value of calculated risks." Tom's first instinct was to decline politely and return to his solitary drinking. But something in Peterson's tone, perhaps a subtle challenge or hint of condescension, stirred the competitive spirit that Tom had thought permanently buried with Sarah. Before he could reconsider, he found himself walking toward the table. "Tom Hartwell," he introduced himself, settling into the remaining chair. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a card player." "Experience is overrated," Peterson replied with that same practiced smile. "Sometimes fresh perspective is exactly what a game needs." The first several hands proceeded conventionally, with modest pots and conservative betting that reflected the small-town nature of the players. Tom discovered that his instincts for reading people, honed by years of dealing with cattle buyers and traveling merchants, served him surprisingly well in poker. He lost some hands and won others, holding his own despite his professed inexperience. Peterson, meanwhile, demonstrated the fluid competence of a professional gambler. His betting was calculated, his conversation engaging, and his card handling flawless. But Tom began to notice subtle patterns. The way Peterson's left hand would drift toward the satchel during particularly tense moments, or how his shuffling technique seemed designed more for show than randomness. As the evening progressed, the stakes gradually increased. What had begun as penny-ante entertainment evolved into something more serious, with pots worth more than many of the players earned in a week. Tom found himself winning more often than probability should have allowed, though Peterson seemed unconcerned by his own moderate losses. "Gentlemen," Peterson announced after nearly 3 hours of play, "I propose we conclude with one final hand. Winner takes all, everything currently on the table." The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through both the players and the growing crowd of spectators. Tom glanced at his modest pile of winnings, mentally calculating that the total pot represented more money than he typically saw in several months. "I'm afraid I don't have enough cash to match that kind of bet," Tom admitted, starting to push back from the table. Peterson's hand shot out to stop him, the movement so quick it made several observers flinch. "Not so fast, friend. A man like you surely has assets beyond mere coins. That's a fine horse you rode into town tonight, and I imagine your ranch has value." The suggestion that Tom might wager his property, the home he had built with Sarah, sparked a flash of anger that surprised him with its intensity. But before he could voice his objection, Peterson continued with silky persistence. "Of course, if you're not confident in your abilities, I completely understand. Not every man has the courage for high-stakes play." The challenge was so blatant that even the other players shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sheriff Wheeler cleared his throat meaningfully, but Tom raised a hand to forestall any intervention. "I'll play," he said quietly, his voice carrying a steel that made Peterson's eyes sharpen with interest. "But I match your cash bet only, no property stakes." "Excellent," Peterson exclaimed, though Tom detected a flicker of disappointment in his expression. "Then let's see what fate has in store for us." The deal proceeded with ceremonial slowness, each card placed with deliberate precision as the tension in the room mounted. Tom's hand was strong, a full house, kings over tens, but he maintained the careful neutrality he had learned to project throughout the evening. Peterson's betting was aggressive from the first raise, pushing chips forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating his opponents into submission. The other players folded quickly, leaving the two men to face each other across the felt battlefield. "I'll see your bet," Tom said calmly, matching Peterson's substantial wager. "I'd raise you $50. For the first time that evening, Peterson's composure cracked slightly. His hand moved unconsciously toward the leather satchel, and Tom caught a glimpse of something that might have been uncertainty in those pale green eyes. "Interesting," Peterson murmured, studying his cards with renewed attention. "Very interesting." Indeed, he sat silent for nearly a full minute, the entire saloon holding its collective breath as he contemplated his response. Finally, Peterson's familiar smile returned, though it seemed somewhat strained around the edges. "I'm afraid I'm a bit short of cash for that raise, friend, but I have something here that might interest you even more than money." He lifted the leather satchel onto the table, its brass buckles gleaming in the lamplight. The bag was substantial, perhaps the size of a saddle pack, and it seemed to shift slightly as Peterson handled it. "What exactly are you offering, Sheriff?" Wheeler asked, his lawman's instincts clearly troubled by the unconventional wager. Peterson's smile widened, regaining some of its earlier confidence. "Something unique, gentlemen. Something that will make this hand memorable long after the cards are forgotten." With theatrical flair, he opened the satchel's buckles and peeled back its leather flap. The contents drew gasps from around the table and beyond. Two tiny wolf pups, their eyes barely open, nestled in a bed of soft cloth. They were impossibly small, perhaps only days old, their fur still bearing the fluffy texture of newborns. Found them yesterday after dealing with their mother, Peterson explained with casual cruelty. She was threatening my horses, you understand. These little beasts were all that remained of her pack. I figure they're worth at least $50 to the right buyer. Circus folk pay good money for exotic animals. The casual way he discussed killing their mother and commodifying the orphaned pups sent a wave of revulsion through Tom that he struggled to contain. Around the table, he could see similar reactions on the faces of his fellow players, though none spoke up to challenge Peterson's callous attitude. "Call," Tom said simply, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. Peterson laid out his hand with confident flourish, 4 sevens, an undeniably strong showing that would have defeated most holdings. His smile was triumphant as he reached for the chips, but Tom's full house took the pot, and with it the leather satchel, containing 2 helpless creatures who had already lost everything that mattered to them. As the other players dispersed and the evening's excitement faded into memory, Tom found himself alone with his unexpected winnings, wondering what Sarah would have thought about the twist of fate that had just made him responsible for 2 orphaned wild animals. The satchel seemed to pulse with life as he carefully secured its buckles, the tiny inhabitants stirring restlessly within their makeshift nest. Whatever came next, Tom realized, his solitary existence was about to become significantly more complicated. The ride home through the February darkness gave Tom time to contemplate the magnitude of his impulsive decision. The leather satchel bounced gently against his hip as his mare picked her way along the familiar trail, and he could feel the subtle movements of the tiny passengers within. What had seemed like righteous defiance in the heat of the poker game now felt like foolish sentimentality that might well doom the helpless creatures to a slower death than Peterson would have provided. By the time Tom reached his cabin, doubt had settled over him like a heavy blanket. He had no experience with wild animals, no knowledge of their dietary needs, and no reasonable expectation that 2 orphaned wolf pups could survive in human care. Yet, as he carried the satchel into his kitchen and set it carefully on the wooden table, he found himself unable to consider any alternative to trying. The pups were even smaller than they had appeared in the saloon's dim lighting. When Tom opened the satchel and lifted them gently from their cloth nest, they fit easily in his cupped palms, their combined weight no more than that of a single barn cat. Their eyes remained sealed shut, and their breathing was so shallow he had to hold them close to his ear to confirm they were still alive. The larger of the 2, marked with distinctive patches of darker fur that would later earn him the name Shadow, whimpered softly when Tom's fingers touched his tiny ribs. The smaller pup, whose coat showed the storm-grey coloring that would inspire her name, remained ominously still, her breathing barely perceptible. Tom's first challenge was immediate and practical. The pups were clearly too young to eat solid food, and without their mother's milk, they would starve within days. His mind raced through possibilities, recalling fragments of conversations with Sarah about the orphaned lambs and calves they had occasionally rescued over the years. Sarah had possessed an intuitive understanding of young animals that Tom had always admired but never fully comprehended. She would have known exactly what these pups needed, would have moved with confident purpose to provide it. The memory of her gentle hands nursing a sickly foal back to health brought a familiar ache to Tom's chest, but it also sparked an idea. In the medicine cabinet that Sarah had organized with characteristic thoroughness, Tom found a small glass vial that had once contained laudanum for his occasional bouts with rheumatism. The vial's narrow neck, he realized, might serve as a makeshift nipple if he could devise a way to deliver warm milk through it. Working by lamplight, Tom cleaned the vial thoroughly and examined various methods of creating a feeding apparatus. A piece of cloth wrapped around the neck and secured with thread created a crude but functional nipple while a small hole punched through the cloth with a heated needle would allow milk to flow in controlled amounts. The next challenge was obtaining appropriate milk. Tom's single cow was dry this time of year, but he had purchased fresh milk during his trip to town that afternoon. Warming it carefully over the stove, he tested the temperature against his wrist the way he had seen Sarah do with bottles for the neighbor's infants. His first attempt at feeding the pups met with frustration and fear. The larger pup showed interest in the makeshift bottle, but seemed unable to understand how to extract nourishment from it. The smaller one remained frighteningly passive, her tiny body limp in Tom's palm as he tried desperately to coax some sign of life from her. Hours passed in a blur of patient effort and mounting desperation. Tom found himself talking to the pups in the soft, encouraging tone Sarah had used with frightened animals, though he felt foolish doing so. When the larger pup finally managed to draw a few drops of warm milk from the cloth nipple, Tom experienced a surge of relief so intense it left him trembling. The breakthrough with Shadow, as Tom had begun thinking of him, provided hope for his smaller companion. Storm required even more patience, but eventually her survival instincts overcame her weakness, and she too began to accept small amounts of milk from the improvised bottle. That first night established a pattern that would define Tom's existence. For weeks to come, every 2 hours he would warm milk, test its temperature, and carefully feed each pup while monitoring their breathing and general condition. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours, and Tom's days blurred together in a haze of constant vigilance. Doc Morrison's arrival on the third day provided both reassurance and practical guidance. The elderly physician examined the pups with the same careful attention he might devote to human patients, his experienced hands checking their reflexes and general development. "They're stronger than they look," he announced after his examination. "But you're right to be concerned. Wolf pups this young rarely survive without their mother, and the stress of their early separation has weakened them considerably. What can I do?" Tom asked, exhaustion evident in his voice. Doc Morrison studied the makeshift feeding bottle with professional interest, nodding approvingly at Tom's ingenuity. "You're doing about everything that can be done. The milk is helping, though you might consider adding a bit of egg yolk for extra nutrition. Keep them warm, feed them frequently, and hope their natural resilience pulls them through." The addition of beaten egg to their diet proved beneficial, and by the end of the first week, both pups showed marked improvement. Their eyes began to open, revealing the piercing blue gaze that would eventually mature into the golden amber typical of their species. More importantly, they had begun to recognize Tom's scent and voice, showing agitation when he left there, sight and contentment when he returned. Tom found himself marveling at their rapid development. Shadow, true to his name, seemed to prefer staying close to Tom's side, while Storm displayed the independent streak that would characterize her throughout her life. Both pups began to show distinct personalities even in their earliest days, responding differently to Tom's voice and handling. The feeding routine that had initially seemed overwhelming gradually became as natural as any other aspect of Tom's daily life. He learned to read their subtle signals, the particular whimper that meant hunger, the restless movement that indicated discomfort, the contented sighs that told him they were thriving. By the second week, the pups had grown noticeably larger and more alert. Their ears had begun to stand upright, and their legs showed the strength that would eventually carry them across the vast territories they were born to roam. More significantly, they had begun to respond to Tom's presence with obvious affection, their tiny tails wagging frantically whenever he approached. The glass medicine vial, transformed into a symbol of nurturing rather than healing human ailments, sat on Tom's kitchen counter as a daily reminder of the fragile lives he had chosen to protect. Each successful feeding session, each sign of healthy growth, felt like a small victory against the harsh realities of frontier life. As February gave way to March and the worst of winter's grip began to loosen, Tom realized that caring for Shadow And Storm had given him something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The pups needed him, with the complete dependency that only the very young possess, and their need had awakened protective instincts Tom thought had been buried with his wife. The improvised feeding bottle continued to serve its vital function, but Tom could see that the pups were growing rapidly toward the day when they would no longer need such careful tending. The question that haunted his quiet moments was what would happen when two wild creatures reached maturity in the artificial safety of human domesticity. By early April, Shadow and Storm had transformed from helpless newborns into energetic 6-week-old companions whose boundless curiosity turned Tom's orderly cabin into a daily adventure course. The feeding bottle now served only for their evening meals. As both pups had learned to lap milk and softened meat from shallow dishes Tom had repurposed from Sarah's kitchen collection. Their exploration of the cabin revealed personality differences that became more pronounced with each passing day. Shadow approached new discoveries with careful deliberation, sniffing thoroughly before investigation, while Storm dove headfirst into whatever caught her attention, consequences be damned. Tom found himself constantly rescuing her from predicaments of her own making, trapped behind the woodpile, tangled in Sarah's knitting basket, or attempting to scale furniture far beyond her climbing abilities. The pup's playful energy reminded Tom of Sarah's laughter in ways that were both comforting and bittersweet. He began to understand why she had always insisted on keeping the cabin filled with small touches of whimsy and joy. Life was hard enough on the frontier without abandoning the simple pleasures that made each day bearable. It was during one particularly boisterous afternoon play session that Tom decided his young charges needed proper toys rather than Sarah's belongings, which they seemed determined to destroy through enthusiastic investigation. His woodworking skills, developed through years of ranch maintenance, proved adequate for crafting simple playthings from pine scraps left over from various building projects. The first toy was rudimentary, a rounded chunk of wood with rough edges smoothed down to prevent injury. Tom carved shallow grooves into its surface to provide grip for small teeth and paws, then watched with satisfaction as both pups immediately claimed it as their most prized possession. Shadow preferred to carry the toy around like a trophy, while Storm seemed convinced it was meant for vigorous attacking. Encouraged by their enthusiasm, Tom expanded his efforts. A set of connected wooden rings provided entertainment for tugging, games that often ended with both pups tumbling across the cabin floor in delighted confusion. Carved wooden balls of varying sizes became objects of intense competition, with each pup developing preferred sizes and textures. The most successful creation was a simplified wooden replica of a wolf, whittled during long evenings by lamplight while the pups dozed near the fireplace. Tom had intended it as a decorative piece, but Shadow and Storm immediately adopted it as a surrogate pack member, taking turns grooming it with the same careful attention they devoted to each other. Working with his hands again brought Tom unexpected peace, the familiar rhythm of carving, the satisfaction of seeing rough wood transformed into purposeful objects, and the pups' obvious delight in his creations provided a creative outlet he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Each evening's woodworking session became a meditation on the simple pleasure of making something useful and beautiful. As the pups grew stronger and more adventurous, Tom realized that confining them to the cabin was becoming both impractical and unfair to their developing instincts. Their first supervised exploration of the immediate area around his property revealed capabilities that amazed him. Despite their youth, both pups possessed natural tracking abilities that allowed them to follow scent trails invisible to human perception. Storm, in particular, showed remarkable intelligence in reading the landscape. She would pause at specific spots where deer had passed days earlier, her nose working with scientific precision to interpret information hidden in the ground and vegetation. Shadow demonstrated a different but equally impressive skill in recognizing potential dangers, alerting Tom to approaching riders while they were still miles away. The decision to bring them into town required careful consideration. Tom knew that introducing 2 wolf pups to Cedar Creek's residents would provoke reactions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. But the pups needed socialization with humans beyond their single caretaker, and Tom found himself craving adult conversation. After weeks of relative isolation, their first public appearance created exactly the sensation Tom had anticipated. Loading both pups into a specially modified crate in his wagon bed, he rode into Cedar Creek on a mild Saturday morning when most residents would be conducting their weekly business. The pups, now large enough to be obviously wolves rather than dogs, attracted immediate attention from every person they passed. Doc Morrison was the first to approach, his medical curiosity overcoming any reservations about their wild nature. "My word, Tom," he exclaimed, studying Shadow and Storm with professional interest. "They've grown remarkably. You've done something extraordinary here." Sheriff Wheeler's reaction was more measured, but equally fascinated. "They're certainly impressive animals," he admitted, though Tom detected underlying concern in his voice. "Just remember that they're wolves, not pets. Their instincts will assert themselves eventually." The warning was reasonable, but Tom found himself defensive on behalf of his charges. Shadow and Storm had shown nothing but affection and loyalty since their arrival in his life. They followed his commands, responded to their names, and demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested a capacity for genuine domestication. Murphy's response provided the most dramatic moment of their public debut. The Saloon. Heeper emerged from his establishment expecting to see exotic curiosities, but stopped short when Shadow fixed him with an unblinking golden stare that seemed to recognize him as connected to their origin story. "That's quite a development from our poker game," Murphy observed carefully. "Peterson claimed they'd never survive without their mother." "Peterson was wrong about many things," Tom replied quietly, though he made no effort to elaborate. The townspeople's reactions ranged widely. Children were fascinated and wanted to pet the big puppies, while their mothers maintained cautious distance. The older men generally expressed admiration for Tom's success in raising wild animals, though several muttered concerns about the wisdom of keeping dangerous predators as companions. What surprised Tom most was how naturally Shadow and Storm adapted to the social situation. Rather than cowering or displaying aggression, they observed the humans around them with intelligent interest, seeming to understand that these strangers posed no threat. Storm even allowed several brave children to stroke her fur, though she remained alert and ready to retreat to Tom's side at the first sign of trouble. The visit to town accomplished its intended goals of socialization and community reintroduction. But it also crystallized Tom's understanding of the unique position he and his wolves would occupy in Cedar Creek society. They were no longer completely wild, but neither were they domestic animals in any conventional sense. They existed in a category all their own, which meant that Tom would need to navigate social expectations with the same careful balance he used in their daily care. Returning home that evening, Tom reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. Since that February night at Murphy's poker table, the wooden toys scattered around his cabin, the feeding dishes that had replaced the makeshift bottle, and the 2 magnificent creatures sleeping contentedly near his fireplace, all testified to a transformation he could never have imagined. As he carved a new toy by lamplight, a simple wooden stick designed for fetch games, Tom found himself humming one of Sarah's favorite songs for the first time since her death. The melody seemed to comfort the pups, who stirred briefly before, settling back into peaceful sleep, and Tom realized that his heart was finally beginning to heal from the wounds that winter had inflicted upon it. Summer arrived early that year, transforming the Colorado Territory from winter's harsh browns and graze into the vibrant greens that made frontier life bearable. Shadow and Storm, now 6 months old and approaching the size of adult dogs, had grown into their distinctive personalities with a clarity that never failed to amaze Tom. Where once he had seen only 2 adorable wolf pups, he now recognized individuals as complex and unique as any human companions he had known. Shadow had developed into a thoughtful, protective creature whose cautious nature balanced perfectly with Storm's adventurous spirit. He preferred to observe new situations from a safe distance, analyzing potential threats before committing to action. When Tom worked around the property, Shadow positioned himself strategically to maintain visual contact while monitoring their surroundings for anything unusual. Storm, by contrast, approached life with the enthusiasm of someone convinced that every new experience held potential for excitement. Her intelligence manifested in creative problem-solving and an almost human-like ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. She had learned to open the cabin door by jumping up and working the latch, could retrieve specific tools from Tom's workshop when asked, and displayed a mischievous sense of humor that reminded him daily of her wild heritage. The most significant change in their relationship occurred when Tom decided it was time to craft proper identification for his wolves. The expanding settlement meant increased traffic through their area, and Tom wanted to ensure that anyone encountering Shadow and Storm would recognize them as domestic companions rather than wild threats. Working with leather salvaged from worn-out tack, Tom crafted 2 sturdy collars designed to accommodate the wolves' continued growth while serving as visible proof of their domesticated status. The leather was supple but strong, dyed a rich brown that complemented their natural coloring. Each collar featured brass fittings that could be adjusted as needed, ensuring long-term utility. The distinctive element that made each collar special was a small bell attached to the front. Tom had purchased the bells from the general store, explaining to the curious shopkeeper that they were for his dogs to help him locate them during their woodland explorations. The sound was gentle but clear, providing both identification and a means of tracking the wolves' movements when they ranged beyond immediate sight. Shadow accepted his collar with dignified resignation, seeming to understand its practical purpose. Even if he found the constant tinkling mildly annoying, Storm, predictably, treated her collar as a fascinating new toy, spending considerable time trying to catch and examine the bell that accompanied her every movement. The collars served their intended purpose admirably, but they also marked a symbolic transition in the relationship between Tom and his wolves. The bells announced their approach to wildlife and humans alike, preventing the kind of surprise encounters that might provoke aggressive responses. More importantly, they demonstrated Tom's commitment to responsible stewardship of creatures that remained fundamentally wild despite their domestic environment. This commitment was tested when Tom decided the time had come to introduce Shadow and Storm to hunting. Their diet of milk, softened meat, and table scraps had served them well during their early development, but Tom recognized that their natural instincts required more authentic outlets. The question was how to provide hunting experience while maintaining the safety and control necessary for their continued coexistence with human society. Their first hunting expedition took place on a crisp morning in late June, when Tom led the wolves into the foothills where game was plentiful and human encounters unlikely. The bells on their collars provided a gentle soundtrack as they moved through the underbrush, their natural grace becoming more apparent with each step away from civilized constraints. Tom had expected to serve primarily as an observer during this initial hunt, but he quickly discovered that Shadow and Storm were looking to him for leadership and guidance. Their domestication had apparently modified their pack instincts to position him as the alpha male, responsible for coordinating group activities and making strategic decisions. This realization both thrilled and sobered Tom. He possessed enough wilderness experience to track game and understand animal behavior, but he had never considered himself qualified to teach hunting skills to apex predators. Yet Shadow and Storm waited patiently for his direction, their attention focused entirely on his movements and vocalizations. The first successful hunt was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A rabbit, startled from cover by Storm's approach, ran directly toward Shadow's position behind a fallen log. The coordination was instinctive and precise, requiring no discussion or planning. Within seconds, the hunt was complete, and both wolves looked to Tom for approval of their performance. Tom's emotional reaction to witnessing this display of natural ability surprised him. Instead of concern about their predatory capabilities, he felt proud of their competence and coordination. Shadow and Storm were magnificent creatures, operating according to instincts refined by thousands of years of evolution. His role was not to suppress those instincts, but to help them find appropriate expression within the constraints of their unusual circumstances. Subsequent hunting expeditions revealed the depth of the wolves' intelligence and their growing trust in Tom's judgment. They learned to respond to subtle hand signals, to coordinate their movements with his strategic positioning, and to defer to his decisions about which prey to pursue and which to leave undisturbed. The hunting partnership also strengthened the bond between the wolves themselves. Shadow's cautious planning balanced Storm's impulsive energy, while her creativity often solved problems that his methodical approach couldn't address. Watching them work together, Tom began to understand the complex social dynamics that made wolves such successful pack hunters. These woodland expeditions became the highlight of each week, providing all three participants with experiences that satisfied needs their domestic life couldn't address. For Shadow and Storm, hunting offered physical challenges and intellectual stimulation that kept them mentally and emotionally healthy. For Tom, the expeditions provided insights into wolf behavior that deepened his appreciation for their remarkable capabilities. The changes in his own perspective were gradual but profound. Where once he had seen two orphaned animals requiring his care and protection, Tom now recognized family members whose unique abilities and personalities enriched his life in ways he was still discovering. The loneliness that had driven him to Murphy's Saloon that February night had been replaced by a sense of belonging that felt as natural as breathing. Their expanding territory brought encounters with other wildlife that tested both the wolves' social skills and Tom's leadership abilities. Mountain cats, bears, and competing wolf packs all posed potential challenges that required careful navigation. Shadow and Storm's responses to these encounters revealed the extent of their trust in Tom's protection and guidance. On one memorable occasion, a large black bear wandered into their hunting area, clearly intent on claiming territorial dominance. Tom's immediate concern was preventing a confrontation that could result in serious injury to his wolves, but Shadow and Storm positioned themselves protectively around him, their body language making clear their willingness to fight if necessary. Standoff resolved peacefully when Tom slowly led his wolves away from the area, demonstrating the kind of tactical retreat that preserved everyone's dignity while avoiding unnecessary conflict. The incident reinforced his understanding that Shadow and Storm viewed him not just as a provider, but as a pack leader worth defending. As summer progressed, the sound of their bells became a familiar part of Tom's daily soundtrack, a gentle reminder that he was no longer alone in the world. The collars had begun as practical necessities, but they had evolved into symbols of the unique family that frontier life and unexpected circumstances had created in the Colorado wilderness. The first anniversary of Sarah's death passed quietly, marked not by the devastating grief Tom had anticipated, but by a gentle melancholy, tempered with genuine gratitude for the life they had shared. Shadow and Storm, now magnificent adult wolves whose presence filled the cabin with vitality, seemed to sense the significance of the day, staying closer to Tom than usual and displaying the kind of intuitive empathy that continued to amaze him. It was on that February evening, as Tom sat before the fireplace, reflecting on the year's transformations, that he made a discovery that would become one of his most treasured memories. Shadow had been restlessly exploring the cabin's corners, investigating spaces he had examined countless times before, when his attention fixed on an old trunk tucked beneath Tom's bed. Working the latch with characteristic persistence, Shadow managed to open the trunk and immediately began investigating its contents. Among the carefully preserved mementos of Tom's marriage was Sarah's favorite woolen shawl, a soft blue-gray creation she had knitted during their second winter together. The shawl still carried the faint scent of the lavender sachets Sarah had used to protect her clothing from moths. Rather than scolding Shadow for his unauthorized exploration, Tom watched with fascination as the wolf carefully lifted the shawl from the trunk and carried it to his usual sleeping spot near the fireplace. Storm quickly joined him, and within minutes both wolves had arranged the shawl into a comfortable nest where they settled for the night. The sight of his wolves sleeping peacefully on Sarah's shawl created an unexpected moment of perfect emotional resolution. Instead of the pain he might have expected from seeing her belongings repurposed, Tom felt a deep sense of rightness, as if Sarah herself had guided Shadow to this particular treasure. The shawl, which had brought her comfort during life, was now providing the same comfort to the creatures who had helped heal Tom's broken heart. From that night forward, Sarah's shawl became Shadow and Storm's preferred sleeping arrangement. They would take turns arranging it just so, with the kind of ritualistic attention that suggested deep emotional significance. The daily sight of them curled together on the blue-gray wool became a symbol of continuity and healing that helped Tom understand how love could transform rather than simply end. Their communication had evolved far beyond the basic commands and responses of their early months together. Shadow and Storm now participated in complex conversations that combined vocalizations, body language, and what Tom could only describe as intuitive understanding. They could differentiate between various types of visitors approaching the property, alerting Tom to the presence of friends like Doc Morrison with gentle whuffs, while warning of strangers with more urgent vocalizations. The sophistication of their protective instincts became apparent when a pack of coyotes began harassing Tom's small herd of cattle during late spring. Rather than confronting the interlopers directly, Shadow and Storm employed tactical approaches that demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking. They would position themselves at opposite ends of the pasture, creating a corridor that guided the coyotes away from the livestock, while making clear that continued trespass would not be tolerated. Their success as livestock guardians enhanced Tom's reputation throughout the territory. Neighboring ranchers, initially skeptical of his unusual companions, began seeking his advice about predator control. Some even offered to pay for Shadow and Storm's services during particularly difficult periods, though Tom politely declined such arrangements, preferring to help his neighbors as a matter of community obligation rather than commercial enterprise. The wolves' growing reputation for intelligence and reliability gradually shifted Cedar Creek's collective opinion from suspicion to grudging respect. Children who had once been forbidden to approach them now begged their parents for permission to visit Tom's property and observe the magnificent creatures up close. Shadow, with his patient temperament, proved particularly tolerant of youthful attention, while Storm preferred to demonstrate her abilities through impressive displays of agility and strength. Doc Morrison became a regular visitor, drawn by his scientific curiosity about the relationship between human and wolf. His observations provided external validation for Tom's belief that Shadow and Storm represented something unique in the annals of animal domestication. "They're not pets," Doc explain to anyone who would listen, and they're not quite wild animals either. Tom has achieved something unprecedented, a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. This partnership was tested repeatedly as territorial disputes escalated throughout the region. The discovery of gold in nearby streams had attracted prospectors whose activities disrupted established wildlife patterns, creating conflicts between human settlers and displaced animal populations. Shadow and Storm's ability to interpret these changing dynamics made them invaluable allies in Tom's efforts to protect his property and livestock. Their most remarkable demonstration of protective intelligence occurred during a late summer evening, when Tom was working in his barn, unaware that a mountain lion had been stalking his cattle from the ridge above his property. Shadow and Storm detected the threat long before Tom's human senses could register any danger, positioning themselves strategically between the predator and its intended prey, while alerting Tom to the situation with urgent but controlled vocalizations. The confrontation never escalated to violence, largely because the mountain lion recognized that it faced not just two wolves, but an organized pack with human intelligence backing their natural abilities. The predator withdrew to seek easier prey elsewhere, leaving Tom's cattle unharmed and reinforcing his confidence in his wolves' protective capabilities. These incidents deepened Tom's understanding of how profoundly Shadow and Storm had altered the dynamics of his homestead. His property had become a sanctuary protected by guardians whose loyalty was absolute, and whose capabilities far exceeded anything he could have achieved alone. The partnership had evolved into something approaching symbiosis, with each member contributing unique strengths to their collective security and prosperity. The emotional healing that accompanied these practical developments surprised Tom with its completeness. The crushing loneliness that had followed Sarah's death had been replaced by a different but equally meaningful form of companionship. Shadow and Storm could not replace his wife, but they had helped him rediscover his capacity for love, loyalty, and hope. Their evening routine had become a cherished ritual. As darkness settled over the territory, Tom would secure his property while Shadow and Storm conducted their own perimeter checks, their bells providing a gentle soundtrack to the approaching night. When their duties were complete, all three would gather in the cabin's warmth, the wolves settling onto Sarah's shawl while Tom read by lamplight or worked on small projects. These quiet moments represented everything Tom valued about his transformed life. The simple comfort of shared space, the security of trusted companions, and the deep satisfaction of relationships built on mutual understanding and respect had restored meaning to his existence in ways that went far beyond mere survival. Yet, even in the midst of such contentment, Tom occasionally noticed subtle changes in his wolves' behavior that suggested new challenges on the horizon. Their protective instincts had sharpened recently, and they displayed increasing alertness to distant sounds and scents that remained undetectable to human perception. Something was stirring in the wider territory, and Shadow and Storm's heightened vigilance suggested that their peaceful existence might soon face its most serious test. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered by a federal marshal whose grim expression suggested its contents would shatter the peaceful routine. Tom had grown to cherish. Shadow and Storm sensed the stranger's tension immediately, positioning themselves protectively around Tom while maintaining the alert but non-threatening posture they had learned to adopt with law enforcement officials. Marshal John Brennan was a weathered man in his 50s, whose bearing suggested extensive experience with frontier violence. He dismounted slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings with the hypervigilance of someone accustomed to expecting trouble from unexpected directions. The wolves' intelligent assessment of his character seemed to reassure him, though. He maintained a respectful distance from the magnificent creatures. "Mr. Hartwell," Brennan began, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, I have information that concerns you directly, and I'm afraid it's not pleasant news." Tom accepted the official envelope with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, though whether from anticipation or dread he couldn't determine. The federal seal seemed to burn his fingers as he broke the wax and unfolded the documents within. What he found would recontextualize everything he thought he understood about the events that had brought Shadow and Storm into his life. The first document was a wanted poster, its edges yellowed from months of circulation through territorial law enforcement offices. The face staring back at Tom was unmistakably that of the smooth-talking gambler who had called himself Marcus Peterson during that fateful poker game at Murphy's Saloon. But the name on the poster was different. Marcus the Viper Vaughn, wanted for bank robbery, cattle rustling, and murder across 3 territories. The reward offered for Vaughn's capture, dead or alive, was substantial enough to feed a family for several years. But more disturbing than the monetary bounty were the detailed descriptions of his criminal activities. Vaughn had spent the past 5 years building a reputation as one of the most ruthless outlaws operating between Colorado and California, a man whose apparent charm masked a capacity for casual violence that had claimed dozens of lives. "This poster was distributed last month," Marshal Brennan explained, watching Tom's face carefully for any sign of recognition. "We've been tracking Vaughn's movements eastward from California, where he robbed 3 banks before disappearing, into the Colorado territory. Several witnesses placed him in this area during the winter." Tom's mind raced as he processed the implications. The charming gambler who had seemed so out of place in Murphy's Saloon had been a wanted fugitive, using Cedar Creek as a temporary refuge from pursuing lawmen. The poker game that had seemed like simple entertainment had actually been reconnaissance, allowing Vaughn to assess the town's defenses and identify potential targets. "There's more," Brennan continued, producing a second document that proved even more disturbing than the first. This one was a report from the Lakota Tribal Council, detailing the theft of sacred wolf pups from a den site that held special significance in their spiritual traditions. The report, translated from Lakota and certified by territorial officials, described how a white man, fitting Vaughn's description, had been observed near the sacred den 3 days before the pups would have been found motherless. Tribal trackers had followed sign indicating that the mother wolf had been shot and killed, her pups taken while they were still too young to survive independently. "The Lakota consider those pups to be spiritually significant," Brennan explained. "Their den site is sacred ground, and the theft of the cubs is considered both a criminal act and a religious desecration. Chief Running Bear has been seeking their return for months." Tom felt his world shifting beneath him as he absorbed this information. Shadow and Storm, the creatures who had brought meaning and purpose back to his life, had been stolen from their rightful place in Lakota territory. Their mother had been murdered not by necessity, as Vaughn had claimed, but as part of a deliberate theft designed to provide the outlaw with a unique gambling stake. The poker game itself took on sinister new dimensions as Tom reconsidered every detail with this fresh perspective. Vaughn's confident betting, his casual manipulation of the pot, and his apparent willingness to wager the pups as if they were mere property all suggested a man who had never intended to honor the results of honest play. "We have reason to believe the game was rigged," Brennan continued, producing additional evidence that made Tom's stomach clench with anger. "Vaughn is known to use marked cards and other cheating devices. Your victory that night may have been the one outcome he didn't anticipate." The implications were staggering. Tom had won Shadow and Storm not through luck or skill, but because Vaughn's own criminal overconfidence had backfired spectacularly. The outlaw had expected to retain control of the stolen pups while also cleaning out the local rancher's cash, but Tom's unexpected victory had disrupted those plans entirely. "Why are you telling me this now?" Tom asked, though he suspected the answer would be equally disturbing. Brennan's expression grew even more serious. Because Vaughan has returned to the territory with a gang of at least 6 men, and we believe he's planning something significant. The timing isn't coincidental. The Territorial Bank in Cedar Creek has been receiving large gold deposits from the mining operations, and your town's harvest festival would provide perfect cover for a robbery. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Vaughan's original visit had been reconnaissance for a larger criminal enterprise, and his return with reinforcements suggested that Cedar Creek had been selected as a target worth significant risk. The poker game had allowed him to assess local wealth, identify key figures, and evaluate potential resistance to criminal activity. There's more, Brennan continued relentlessly. Vaughan holds grudges, and according to our intelligence, he's particularly interested in recovering what he considers his stolen property. He views your wolves as valuable assets that were taken from him unfairly. The threat to Shadow and Storm sent a surge of protective rage through Tom that surprised him with its intensity. The wolves had sensed the emotional shift and moved closer, their bodies tense with readiness to respond to whatever danger their human pack leader had detected. "When do you expect them to make their move?" Tom asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Soon," Brennan replied. "The Harvest Festival begins in 3 days, and that would provide optimal conditions for a coordinated attack. Vaughan's pattern suggests he prefers to strike during community celebrations when law enforcement is spread thin and civilian guard is down." Tom's mind began calculating defensive possibilities while simultaneously processing the moral implications of the situation. Shadow and Storm had been stolen from their rightful place among the Lakota, but they had also become integral members of his own family. The question of where they truly belonged had become infinitely more complicated. "Chief Running Bear is traveling here to reclaim the Pups," Brennan added, apparently reading Tom's thoughts. "But he's also interested in helping defend the town against Vaughan's gang. The theft of the sacred wolves represents a serious offense that requires justice according to Lakota law." The convergence of all these forces, federal law enforcement, Lakota justice, outlaw vengeance, and Tom's desperate need to protect his adopted family, promised a confrontation that would determine not only his future with Shadow and Storm, but the safety of everyone in Cedar Creek. As Marshal Brennan prepared to leave, he handed Tom one final document, a detailed map showing Vaughan's suspected approach routes and probable positions during an attack on the town. The tactical information would be crucial in the coming days, but Tom found himself focusing on something else entirely. The wanted poster's description of Vaughan's known associates included several men whose criminal specialties suggested this would be no simple bank robbery. The gang included explosives experts, sharpshooters, and at least one individual known for his skill with knives and close-quarters combat. Whatever Vaughan was planning, he had assembled the resources to carry it out with devastating effectiveness. That evening, as Shadow and Storm settled onto Sarah's shawl for what might be one of their last peaceful nights together, Tom found himself contemplating the cruel irony that had shaped their relationship. A criminal act had brought them together, but another criminal act now threatened to tear them apart. The question that haunted his preparations was whether the bonds they had formed over the past year would prove strong enough to survive the test of violence and betrayal that awaited them all. The trunk beneath Tom's bed yielded more than memories. When he opened it that night, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and buried beneath layers of Sarah's preserved clothing, lay a Springfield rifle that had not seen daylight since his return from the war 20 years earlier. The weapon represented a chapter of his life he had deliberately closed, but circumstances were forcing him to confront skills and experiences he had hoped never to revisit. Tom's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he unwrapped the rifle. Muscle memory guiding actions his conscious mind had tried to forget. The weapon was exactly as he had left it, cleaned, oiled, and maintained with the obsessive care that had kept him alive through 4 years of warfare. The familiar weight in his hands brought back sensations he had spent 2 decades trying to suppress. Shadow and Storm watched with intense interest as Tom examined the rifle's mechanism, testing the action and checking the sight alignment with the methodical precision of a man whose life had once depended on such details. The wolves seemed to sense that this object represented a different aspect of their human companion, one that carried potential for both protection and destruction. The memories came flooding back despite his efforts to maintain emotional distance. Pennsylvania, 1863. The ridge overlooking Gettysburg, where Tom had spent 3 days picking off Confederate officers with the cold precision that had made him one of the Union Army's most effective snipers. Each shot had saved American lives by disrupting enemy command structure, but each shot had also carved another piece from Tom's soul. He had been 25 then, young enough to believe that war could solve problems cleanly, and old enough to understand the moral weight of taking human life from a distance. His skill with the rifle had been natural, honed by years of hunting to feed his family, and refined by military training that taught him to see enemy soldiers as tactical problems, rather than human beings. The psychological strategies that had allowed him to function as a sniper felt alien now, contaminated by 2 decades of civilian life and the healing influence of Sarah's gentle nature. But the technical skills remained intact, preserved in muscle memory that responded instantly to the rifle's familiar contours and weight distribution. Tom's first task was to assess the tactical situation with military precision rather than civilian anxiety. His property occupied high ground overlooking the most direct approach to Cedar Creek, making it an ideal observation and fire position. The cabin's construction, solid logs chinked with local clay, would provide adequate protection against small arms fire, while the surrounding outbuildings offered multiple fallback positions. The Springfield's effective range of nearly 500 yards meant that Tom could control a significant area around his homestead, but it also meant that Vaughn's gang would likely attempt to neutralize him early in any attack on the town. The strategic value of his position was obvious to anyone with military experience, and Vaughn had reportedly served with Confederate irregulars during the war. Sheriff Wheeler's arrival the next morning brought both practical assistance and emotional support. The lawman understood military tactics from his own wartime service, and his assessment of the defensive possibilities aligned closely with Tom's analysis. "You've got natural fortress here," Wheeler observed, studying the sightlines. "From various positions around the property, good fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and natural obstacles that'll channel any approach. If Vaughn wants to neutralize you, he'll have to expose his men to significant risk." The sheriff's military bearing reminded Tom of the camaraderie that had sustained him through the war's darkest moments. Having an ally who understood both the tactical and psychological demands of combat made the approaching confrontation feel manageable rather than hopeless. Their planning session revealed the extent to which Tom's civilian life had prepared him for this unexpected return to warfare. His knowledge of local terrain, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior provided tactical advantages that pure military training could never have supplied. Shadow and Storm's capabilities added another dimension to their defensive preparations, one that no conventional military manual had ever addressed. "Your wolves change everything," Wheeler admitted, as they watched Shadow and Storm conduct their own reconnaissance of the property's perimeter. They can detect movement long before human senses register anything, and their mobility gives us intelligence capabilities that would require a full cavalry unit to match. The wolves' behavior had shifted dramatically since Marshal Brennan's visit, as if they sensed the approaching danger through channels unavailable to human perception. Their protective instincts, always strong, had intensified to the point where they refused to let Tom out of their sight for more than a few minutes. When he moved around the property, they flanked him automatically, maintaining positions that provided optimal security coverage. More remarkably, Shadow and Storm began demonstrating coordinated tactical behavior that suggested an understanding of military concepts Tom had never attempted to teach them. They would position themselves to cover each other's movements, communicate through subtle vocalizations that carried information across considerable distances, and establish overlapping patrol patterns that left no approach to the property unmonitored. Doc Morrison's arrival with medical supplies and tactical advice completed their defensive preparations. The elderly physician had served as a field surgeon during the war, and his understanding of combat medicine proved invaluable in preparing for casualties that seemed increasingly inevitable. "I've treated gunshot wounds from every type of weapon likely to be used," Doc explained as he organized his surgical instruments. "The key is controlling bleeding quickly and preventing shock. Your wolves will need different treatment protocols if they're injured, but the basic principles remain the same." The prospect of Shadow and Storm being harmed in the coming fight created an emotional vulnerability that Tom struggled to manage. His military training emphasized emotional detachment as essential for effective combat performance, but his love for the wolves made such detachment impossible. They were family, not tactical assets, and their safety mattered more than strategic objectives. Chief Running Bear's arrival on the second day brought both additional complications and unexpected opportunities. The Lakota leader approached Tom's property with the dignity and presence that marked him as a man accustomed to command, though his interest in Shadow and Storm was unmistakably personal and spiritual. "The wolves are sacred to my people," Running Bear explained through the interpreter who accompanied him. "Their theft was an insult that demands justice, but their welfare matters more than revenge. If they have found peace in your care, that must be considered." The chief's examination of Shadow and Storm revealed a depth of animal understanding that impressed even Tom. Running Bear seemed to communicate with the wolves through subtle gestures and vocalizations, observing their responses with the attention of someone reading a complex text written in a familiar language. "They are content," he announced after lengthy observation. "The spirits have guided them to where they needed to be. Our concern now must be protecting them from the man who stole them from their first home." This unexpected alliance transformed Tom's tactical situation dramatically. Running Bear had brought 12 warriors whose tracking and combat skills had been refined through generations of warfare with both natural predators and human enemies. Their knowledge of Vaughn's movements, gathered through scouting networks that covered hundreds of miles, provided intelligence no conventional law enforcement could match. "The outlaw camps 3 miles north," Running Bear reported. 7 men, heavily armed, with horses selected for speed rather than endurance. They plan to strike tomorrow night during the festival, when the town's attention is focused on celebration rather than security. The timing created both opportunities and challenges for their defensive preparations. The festival would indeed provide cover for Vaughn's approach, but it would also ensure that innocent civilians were present in any combat zone. Protecting the townspeople while confronting the gang would require coordination and precision that pushed their improvised alliance to its limits. Tom spent the final evening cleaning and preparing his weapons with the ritualistic attention he had learned to associate with pre-combat preparation. The Springfield rifle received particular focus, each component examined and tested until he was satisfied with its condition. His sidearm, a Colt revolver that had served him well during hunting expeditions, was likewise prepared for immediate use. Shadow and Storm seemed to understand that tomorrow would bring danger unlike anything they had previously encountered. Their evening routine was subdued, lacking the playful energy that usually characterized their interaction with Sarah's shawl. Instead, they positioned themselves strategically around the cabin, maintaining vigilant watch, while allowing themselves only brief periods of rest. The tactical briefing with Sheriff Wheeler, Chief Running Bear, and the assembled defenders revealed the complexity of their situation. Protecting the town required coordination between federal marshals, local law enforcement, Lakota warriors, and civilian volunteers whose combat experience ranged from extensive military service to complete innocence of violence. Tom's role as anchor for the defensive perimeter placed enormous responsibility on his shoulders, but it also positioned him where his skills could have maximum impact. The high ground around his property commanded the approaches Vaughn would most likely use, and his sniper training made him ideally suited to disrupt the gang's coordination during their initial assault. As midnight approached and the defenders took their final positions, Tom found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A lonely widower seeking companionship in a frontier saloon had become the cornerstone of a multi-ethnic alliance defending a community against criminal violence. The two wolf pups won in a rigged poker game had evolved into tactical partners, whose capabilities would help determine the outcome of tomorrow's battle. The Springfield rifle lay beside him as he took what might be his last peaceful rest, its familiar weight a reminder that some skills, once learned, could never be completely forgotten. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned about warfare, survival, and the bonds that connected unlikely allies in the face of mortal danger. The Harvest Festival's cheerful sounds drifted across the valley as families gathered in Cedar Creek's main square, their laughter and music providing stark contrast to the tension that gripped Tom's fortified position. Shadow and Storm had been restless since dawn, their acute senses detecting movements and scents that human perception couldn't register. By early afternoon, their alertness had escalated to the focused intensity that preceded their hunting expeditions. Chief Running Bear approached Tom's position as the sun reached its zenith, carrying an ornately carved pipe whose significance transcended its practical function. The peace pipe, crafted from red stone and adorned with eagle feathers, represented generations of Lakota tradition and the sacred bonds that connected all living creatures within the natural order. "This belonged to my grandfather," Running Bear explained as he offered the pipe to Tom with ceremonial gravity. "He carried it through many battles, and it protected him when death seemed certain. Today, it will symbolize the alliance between our peoples and the sacred duty we share to protect the innocent." Tom accepted the pipe with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he was being entrusted with something far more valuable than any material object. The carved stone felt warm against his palms, as if it retained the spiritual energy of the countless ceremonies in which it had played a central role. "I'm honored," Tom replied quietly, "but I'm not sure I'm worthy of such trust. The wolves chose you," Running Bear responded with simple certainty. "That is worthiness enough." The ceremony was brief but deeply moving. Chief Running Bear lit the pipe with traditional materials, offering prayers to the four directions, while Shadow and Storm watched with respectful attention. When the pipe was passed to Tom, he felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a mantle, connecting him to forces larger than his individual survival. The first sign of approaching danger came from Storm, whose sharp bark alerted the defenders to movement on the northern ridge nearly an hour before human eyes could detect anything suspicious. Shadow immediately positioned himself between Tom and the perceived threat, his body tense with readiness, while his golden eyes tracked invisible movements through the forest. Through his rifle's scope, Tom finally spotted them. 7 mounted, figures moving with the practiced stealth of men accustomed to avoiding detection. Marcus Vaughn rode at their center, his distinctive black coat visible even at considerable distance. The gang's approach was methodical and professional, suggesting military experience that would make them formidable opponents. The defenders' communication system, coordinated through a network of mirror signals and bird calls, allowed information to flow between positions without alerting the approaching outlaws to the extent of the resistance they would face. Sheriff Wheeler's position in town, Chief Running Bear's warriors hidden in the forest, and Tom's elevated observation post created interlocking fields of fire that would channel any assault into predetermined killing zones. Vaughn's gang reached the edge of town just as the festival activities reached their peak enthusiasm. The timing was perfect from their perspective: maximum distraction and minimum security presence. What they couldn't know was that every apparent civilian carried concealed weapons and had been briefed on defensive procedures developed through careful coordination between law enforcement and community leaders. The first shots came from the outlaws attempting to establish control of the bank, their violent entrance shattering the peaceful atmosphere with sudden brutality. Children's screams mixed with the sharp reports of gunfire as families scrambled for cover behind hastily constructed barricades. The festival's joyful celebration transformed instantly into a scene of chaos and terror. Tom's Springfield rifle spoke with the authority that had made him legendary during the war, its first shot dropping one of Vaughn's men from horseback with clinical precision. The range was considerable, but muscle memory guided his aim with deadly accuracy, proving that some skills remained intact despite decades of disuse. Shadow and Storm responded to the gunfire with coordinated action that demonstrated their understanding of pack tactics applied to human warfare. Shadow positioned himself to guard Tom's left flank, while Storm circled wide to provide intelligence about enemy movements that might threaten their position from unexpected directions. Chief Running Bear's warriors emerged from concealment like ghosts materializing from the forest itself, their traditional weapons proving devastatingly effective against outlaws expecting only conventional resistance. War cries echoed across the valley as Lakota fighters engaged Vaughn's men with the ferocity of defenders protecting sacred ground. The battle's first phase established the defensive perimeter exactly as planned, with Vaughn's gang finding themselves caught between multiple sources of coordinated resistance rather than facing the easy target they had anticipated. Their horses, selected for speed rather than combat reliability, became liabilities as gunfire and war cries spooked them into panic. Tom's second shot shattered Vaughn's left stirrup, sending the outlaw leader tumbling from his mount, while his carefully planned assault dissolved into confusion and retreat. But rather than fleeing, Vaughn rallied his remaining men with the desperate courage of someone whose reputation depended on completing the mission regardless of cost. "He's not running," Tom called to Running Bear, who had taken position behind a fallen log barely 50 yards away. "He's regrouping for another assault." The peace pipe lay beside Tom's rifle, its presence providing spiritual comfort, while the weapon delivered practical protection. The combination seemed to embody the unlikely alliance that was proving more effective than any purely military response could have achieved. Storm's sharp warning bark indicated movement from the eastern approach, confirming Tom's suspicion that Vaughn was attempting to flank their prepared positions. The outlaw leader's military experience was showing as he adapted quickly to the unexpected resistance and began employing tactics designed to exploit perceived weaknesses in their defensive arrangement. The second assault came with desperate intensity as Vaughn's surviving men charged multiple positions simultaneously in an attempt to overwhelm the defenders through sheer aggression. But the coordination between human defenders and wolf intelligence proved superior to conventional military tactics, creating a dynamic response that adapted instantly to changing circumstances on the battlefield. The final confrontation began when Vaughn broke from his remaining men and charged directly toward Tom's position, abandoning tactical caution in favor of personal vengeance. His horse's hooves thundered against the rocky ground as he closed the distance with reckless speed, a revolver in each hand and murder blazing in his pale green eyes. Tom's rifle was empty, the last shot having accounted for another of Vaughn's gang members who had attempted to flank the Lakota positions. The Spencer required precious seconds to reload, time that Vaughan's charge had eliminated through sheer audacity and desperate courage. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt revolver, but even as his fingers closed around the grip, he knew the geometry of the situation favored his attacker. Vaughan's triumphant laugh echoed across the valley as he bore down on the man who had humiliated him in that poker game nearly a year ago. The wolf pups that should have been his bargaining chips, the money that should have filled his pockets, and the reputation that should have been enhanced by easy victory, all had been stolen by this interfering rancher whose lucky draw had disrupted carefully laid plans. But Vaughan had made a critical miscalculation in his assessment of Tom's defenses. He had planned for human resistance, prepared for conventional weapons, and anticipated the tactical responses of experienced soldiers. What he had not considered was the possibility that two magnificent wolves would view his attack on their adopted pack leader as a mortal threat requiring immediate and decisive action. Shadow moved with the fluid precision of a natural predator, his powerful legs launching him from concealment behind a boulder just as Vaughan's horse reached the closest approach to Tom's position. The wolf's timing was perfect, his trajectory calculated with the instinctive mathematics that guided successful hunts, and his impact devastating in its effectiveness. Vaughan's horse reared in terror as 120 pounds of focused wolf fury struck, its rider with the force of a cannonball. The outlaw's carefully aimed shots went wide as Shadow's momentum carried both man and wolf in a tumbling mass of violence that ended with Vaughan pinned beneath his attacker, his weapons scattered beyond reach. Storm's contribution to the coordinated assault was no less effective for being less dramatic. While Shadow engaged Vaughan directly, Storm positioned herself to intercept any attempt at escape, her golden eyes fixed on the struggling outlaw with the unwavering intensity of a predator who had identified her prey and would not be denied. Tom's intervention prevented what would have been certain death for Vaughan, though whether from mercy or a desire for justice remained unclear even to himself. The outlaw leader, bloodied and broken but still defiant, found himself staring up at the man whose interference had destroyed his carefully planned criminal enterprise. "You cheated," Tom said quietly, his Colt revolver trained on Vaughan's chest, while Shadow maintained his position astride the fallen outlaw. The poker game, the cards, everything about that night was a lie. Vaughan's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of complete defeat. "Everything's a lie out here, Hartwell. The only truth is what you can take and hold." He gestured weakly toward Shadow and Storm, who flanked Tom like guardian angels carved from living stone. "Even your precious wolves were stolen goods. I killed their mother and took them for my own purposes. Does that knowledge change how much you love them?" The question struck deeper than any physical wound could have reached, forcing Tom to confront the moral complexity of relationships built on foundations of violence and theft. Shadow and Storm had indeed been stolen from their natural place in the world, torn from their mother and their people through an act of casual cruelty. Yet the love that had grown between them and Tom was no less real for having originated in criminal activity. From his coat pocket, Vaughan produced a playing card, the ace of spades that had been his trademark marking device throughout years of crooked gambling. The card bore subtle scratches and indentations that allowed him to identify it by touch, giving him the advantage that had made his poker success possible. Now, however, the card showed new damage, a bullet hole directly through its center, testament to the violence that had finally caught up with its owner. "I marked every important card in that deck," Vaughan admitted with perverse pride. "Should have won every hand, taken every dollar you poor farmers had saved. Your victory was an accident, a freak occurrence that I've been paying for ever since." Sheriff Wheeler's arrival with reinforcements ended the confrontation's dramatic phase, though its emotional implications would resonate far longer. Vaughan and his surviving gang members were secured with the efficiency of experienced law enforcement, while the wounded received medical attention from Doc Morrison and his hastily assembled team of volunteers. But the most significant moment came when Chief Running Bear approached Tom and his wolves, carrying himself with the dignity of someone prepared to make a profound sacrifice for the greater good. The Lakota leader had every right to reclaim Shadow and Storm, whose spiritual significance to his people had been explained in detail during their alliance preparations. "The wolves must choose," Running Bear announced in English, his words carrying the weight of tribal law and personal wisdom. "They were stolen from my people, but they have found family with you. Their hearts will guide them to where they belong." The moment of choice was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Running Bear called to Shadow and Storm in their ancestral language, offering them the freedom to return to wild spaces where their kind had roamed for countless generations. Tom remained silent, knowing that any attempt to influence their decision would dishonor both the wolves and the trust Running Bear had placed in their judgment. Shadow approached the chief first, his massive head lowering in respectful acknowledgement of the authority and wisdom he sensed in this weathered leader. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it seemed he might choose the wild heritage that called to his deepest instincts. But then Shadow turned back to Tom, moving to his familiar position at his human pack leader's right side. Storm followed without hesitation, completing the formation that had become their signature arrangement during countless hunting expeditions and defensive preparations. Chief Running Bear nodded with satisfaction that held no disappointment, only recognition of a truth that transcended human law and tribal custom. "They have chosen well," he announced to the assembled crowd of townspeople who had witnessed the entire confrontation. "Love that survives such testing is sacred regardless of species." The celebration that followed transformed Cedar Creek's interrupted harvest festival into something approaching legend, with the story of the Wolfman and his magnificent companions becoming the foundation for tales that would be told around frontier campfires for generations to come. Spring had returned to the Colorado Territory with the gentle insistence that characterized all natural cycles of renewal and growth. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Vaughan's gang, and the scars left by that violent day had largely healed, leaving behind stories that grew more heroic with each telling and bonds that had been strengthened rather than broken by shared danger. Tom stood on the porch of his expanded cabin, watching Shadow and Storm teach their 3 young pups the fundamental lessons of pack behavior and territorial awareness. The sight never failed to move him, representing as it did the continuation of the unlikely family that circumstances and fate had created in the wilderness of frontier Colorado. Storm had given birth to the pups in early winter, seeking out the privacy of the cave system that honeycombed the ridge behind Tom's property. Shadow had proven to be a devoted father, sharing protective and teaching duties with the patience that had always characterized his approach to new challenges. The pups, 2 females and 1 male, had inherited the intelligence and loyalty of their parents while developing their own distinct personalities that promised future adventures for the extended pack. The formal portrait hanging in Tom's kitchen captured a moment that had become symbolic of the transformation Cedar Creek had undergone since that February night in Murphy's Saloon. Commissioned by the town council and executed by a traveling photographer who specialized in frontier documentation, the image showed Tom flanked by Shadow and Storm in their full adult magnificence, their golden eyes reflecting the pride and contentment that had replaced the uncertainty of their early months together. The photograph had required considerable patience from all 3 subjects, as wolves were not naturally inclined to remain motionless for the extended periods necessary for proper exposure. But the final result was worth the effort, creating a lasting record of the partnership that had become legendary throughout the territory. Copies of the portrait hung in Murphy's Saloon, the sheriff's office, and the homes of families whose lives had been touched by the extraordinary relationship between man and wolf. Tom's role in the community had evolved far beyond his original position as a solitary rancher seeking only to be left alone with his grief. The events surrounding Vaughan's attack had revealed leadership qualities that his neighbors had not previously recognized, and his unique relationship with the Lakota people had made him an invaluable mediator in territorial disputes that might otherwise have escalated to violence. Chief Running Bear's frequent visits to Tom's homestead had developed into a friendship that bridged cultural divides with the ease of mutual respect and shared experience. The Lakota leader's grandchildren often accompanied him on these visits, learning English from Tom while teaching him elements of their ancestral language. Shadow and Storm served as patient tutors in their own right, demonstrating hunting techniques and pack behavior that connected the young Lakota to their spiritual heritage. The peace pipe that Running Bear had given Tom during the battle preparations had become a cherished symbol of alliance and understanding. Displayed prominently in the cabin's main room, it served as a reminder that the bonds forged in crisis could endure long after immediate dangers had passed. Tom had learned to use the pipe properly, participating in ceremonies that honored both Lakota tradition and the unique circumstances that had brought their peoples together. Doc Morrison's regular visits had likewise evolved from medical necessity to genuine friendship, with the elderly physician serving as Tom's primary connection to the broader intellectual currents that shaped territorial development. Their evening conversations, often conducted while Shadow and Storm dozed contentedly near the fireplace, ranged across topics from natural philosophy to political theory, providing Tom with mental stimulation that balanced the physical demands of frontier life. The changes in Tom himself were perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the year's transformation. The crushing loneliness that had driven him to seek company in Murphy's saloon had been replaced by a sense of belonging that encompassed not only his immediate pack family, but the entire community that had rallied to defend their shared values against criminal aggression. His grief for Sarah had evolved from the raw devastation of fresh loss to a mature acceptance that honored their shared past, while embracing the possibilities of an uncertain future. The wedding ring he still wore had become a symbol of continuity rather than loss, representing the love that had prepared him to recognize and nurture the unexpected family that fate had provided. The wolves' integration into community life had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Tom's own. Shadow and Storm were now recognized as valuable assets whose protective instincts and intelligence served the entire territory. Their offspring promised to continue this tradition, with several neighboring ranchers already expressing interest in forming partnerships similar to Tom's original arrangement. The annual harvest festival had been permanently modified to include a ceremony honoring the alliance between human and animal that had saved Cedar Creek from Vaughan's criminal enterprise. Children who had witnessed the battle would spend their adult lives telling stories of the Wolfman and his magnificent companions, ensuring that the legend would survive long after its original participants had passed from the scene. Murphy's Saloon had installed a permanent display commemorating the poker game that had started everything, complete with a replica of the leather satchel that had contained 2 orphaned wolf pups on that long-ago February night. The display drew visitors from throughout the territory, transforming Cedar Creek into a destination for travelers seeking authentic frontier experiences. As evening settled over the valley, Tom called his expanded pack home for their nightly gathering. Shadow and Storm responded immediately, their pups following with the eager obedience of youngsters learning proper social behavior. The sight of 5 wolves arranging themselves around Sarah's blue-gray shawl created a tableau that perfectly captured the harmony Tom had never imagined possible during his darkest hours of grief. The sound of their contented breathing filled The cabin as Tom settled into his evening reading, the family he had never expected surrounding him with warmth and security that made every hardship worthwhile. Outside, the Colorado wilderness stretched endless and challenging. But inside, love had transformed a simple frontier cabin into something approaching paradise. The poker chips from that fateful game still rested in Tom's desk drawer, worn smooth. By handling but preserved as tangible reminders of the chance encounter that had changed everything. Sometimes late at night, when the wolves slept deeply and the cabin was filled with peaceful silence, Tom would hold the chips and marvel at the mysterious ways in which destiny had woven purpose from desperation, family from solitude, and hope from the ashes of loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight offered the perfect contentment of a man who had found his place in the world through the most unlikely of circumstances. The lonely cowboy, who had won 2 wolf pups in a poker game, had discovered that love, once given freely, multiplied rather than diminished, creating abundance where scarcity had once reigned supreme.